expertise. So say the newsroom has located the journalists, what can they do then afterwards to actually get in touch with them? What are the options for speaking to them?
So I also just want to say thank you for having me on this panel. I think everyone on here is a superstar. And I echo everything that Samantha and Nora have spoken to. Also, just want to mention that one of the functions of the chaos that's being deliberately created is, of course, shuffling people. So there's a detention shuffle attendant to most of these pickups, and that's by design, right? So we have more beds in the South. I think there are about close to 60,000 people who are being detained currently, which is actually the number that it was predicted it was slotted to hold before. Of course, a big, beautiful budget was enacted in part to triple ICE's budget. This is important because, as Nora and Sam have highlighted, we want to have pre-arrest protocols in place. I think that's our best leverage against the chaos. And as Sam just mentioned, DHS and ICE can transfer detainees to any authorized facility. Again, the transfers are strategic. We're looking at the government's smart too, right? So they're forum shopping. They're trying to figure out where they're going to get the best outcome if this case ends up going up the chain into the federal courts. And I think it's just important to also flag that there are so many agencies, which I think Nora had mentioned, this multi-agency onslaught is what we're trying to navigate. So we have, of course, ICE under DHS. We have EOIR and its many components, including the immigration courts under the Department of Justice. So that's actually more of like an extension of the law enforcement infrastructure. And then we have, our top diplomat at the Secretary of State weighing in on a lot of these complicated decisions, particularly where visas are invoked, because of course visas are under the Department of State's purview. So just to circle back, because the highest number of detention beds is in the South, we should be expecting southern facilities in Texas and Louisiana. And Texas, by the way, my state has the highest number of beds available. I think that Congress has enacted it so that by the end of this year or maybe mid next year, we will actually get to 100,000 beds that we can that would be able to house detainees. So it's more likely, of course, that these transfers take place when the arrest is planned out versus when it just happens spontaneously. But to that point of how you're going to get in touch with them, each facility has its own set of communication rules. So you would need to look it up on that particular facility's website. They have very tailored kind of rules surrounding their visitation, phone, mail, etc. So you can check their website. You can also check the ICE facility page for contact information. Some facilities do allow phone and video calls, but others are more restrictive. And if it's an attorney that's meeting with the journalist or the reporter who has been detained, the attorney would need to send in what's called a G28. It's kind of like a form of representation. The detainee then has to sign that and send it back to the attorney. And in the middle, the staff of the facility kind of brokers the communication between the attorney and the detainee. So I guess long story short is once we're at that point where we know a person is located, we've got to check to see what the rules specific to that facility are. And as Sam said, sometimes that's just like for Dallas County, I might be able to do a Dallas County lookup and figure out where a person is. For Ayman Suleiman, he's at the Butler County Jail. And for others that are in their ICE that are at ICE facilities, we would need to look that up on ICE's website.
And what about getting someone the physical things that they might need in detention? First of all, what should newsrooms be thinking about of what types of physical things would someone need? And then is it also varying from place to place what items could be actually given to someone in detention?
So most of those facilities actually also maintain, because this is such a common question, right? How do I get someone their things, or how do I get things from that person? So they'll have kind of like a tab on their website sending items to detainees, something along those lines, and that will provide that facility specific information. I think there are a lot of considerations around the question that you're asking, Caitlin, because on the one hand, we're talking about pre-arrest protocol. And again, Nora and Sam have emphasized like getting an attorney right there to be the person who is at the front lines of this arrest, of this detention, is so important in order for us to keep pace with all of the chaos that we're surrounded by. So for that attorney, the attorney or the detainee, him or herself, would need to probably have the notice to appear. It's abbreviated, it's truncated to NTA. That's really the charging document that the government's using. So that will delineate most likely the course that the immigration proceedings would take. That's one very important document for those two participants, the attorney and the detainee, to have, as well as what's called the Record of Inadmissible Alien, the I-213, which is an analog to a police report. It's basically the immigrant's immigration history. But in terms of what the reporter or the journalist might have, that I think newsrooms should be prepared um, to broker, again, to negotiate with the attorney or with the person who is detained, is critical ID documents, a history of what they have experienced here immigration wise, a list of their family members, whether or not they need any medication. Sometimes we've heard these horror stories of people who are detained. They actually can't get the medication they need. So I think having that up front and approaching the facility with it is critical to the detainee's well-being. Um, and of course, the detained person's choice of preferred attorney. So if newsrooms are able to prepare in advance a short checklist and kind of secure what way those documents can be transmitted to the attorney, that would be incredibly helpful and give us a jump start in the process. I think also, although this is not my area, so I defer definitely to the other experts, I would think that it would be important for later on down the line in terms of establishing that person's case in court to kind of document the reporter's past public expressions that can help establish credibility, ties to the community, and risk of harm.
Thanks, Miriam. I wanted to pick up on something you said about the checklist, and Alejandra, I wanted to bring you into the conversation because I know that's precisely something you've been working on. So, tell us about what you've been working on for journalists and newsrooms in Chicago and how it's been received so far, in that community.
Thank you. And it's such a pleasure to be here with all of you. Thank you for taking the time. So I am part of a group of reporters who essentially just is meeting on group chat to kind of chat about what we are experiencing, our fears, sharing our reporting, that kind of thing. Um, and as part of that initiative, we sort of learned from each other that a lot of us had very similar questions. How should we prepare ourselves in case of possible detention? A lot of us sound like immigrants, look like immigrants, and given what happened with the Supreme Court decision last week, it became, well, even more terrifying, to be quite honest with you. And so what we are have created is essentially we went out and reported what other newsrooms have done to protect journalists who are foreign correspondents and sort of the kind of information that they collect before they send a foreign correspondent abroad, especially to a country that is considered an authoritarian regime. And so we put it together on essentially a Google Doc and the kinds of questions that Miriam was just talking about, right? Like if you, what kind of medical information do you need to tell your editor that the kind of medicine that you may need if you were detained, for example? Who is the person who should be contacted if there is an emergency? If they do have an immigration attorney, what is the name of the immigration attorney? Who, because that person will be most familiar with the case. Um, and really urging newsrooms to have honest conversations with their reporters to really get to know what their fears are and how they can mitigate, to Nora's point, how do they can mitigate those fears. We obviously don't want any reporter to be taken away from their beat. They work really hard to be where they are, but there are ways in which newsrooms can mitigate risks. For example, if there's a reporter who has more of a high profile risk, they may consider having the reporter report from the newsroom itself and sending another reporter out to the streets to cover the actual event. Reporters can write everything that is being fed to them from the reporters on the street and still offer all of the context and all of the information that they've gathered from the years of covering immigration, for example. So those are some of the things that we're thinking about. Something that we have really encouraged newsrooms as well is to talk to immigration attorneys. They are really the experts, and they're the ones who can really help prepare the journalists and prepare the newsroom if something like this were to happen here.
That's great, Alejandra. It's a really important resource and conversation to have amongst journalists too. Immigration attorneys have come up several times in the various answers. So anyone who wants to field this, how do you find an immigration attorney? Where do you find these experts who can help?
Well, I'm happy to jump in. It's so hard. And I think it's important to recognize how difficult in a given crisis moment response, thoughtful response for the reporter that has been picked up, and triage can be. Those can become incredibly tenuous uphill battles. And so a part of why I think all of us continue to say that there is the deep need for newsrooms to prepare, that's really because the chaos that ensues upon arrest and detention bring their own further layers and wrinkles of injustice and often opacity within the legal system. The very difficulty that Miriam, for example, named in finding people and how Sam described it. Like the very reason that we believe in mitigation is because of how layers of difficulty can just pile on. And the first initial difficulty can be finding a trusted, credible, expert lawyer who knows how to deal with this type of case. And there are a number of ways to do that. I would defer first and foremost to Miriam here because Miriam is so steeped in this. But I believe in the powerful word of mouth of lawyers in networks that we know. Start with the people in your circles because not everyone here is going to be an expert on Chicago and immigration issues local to the region. Others might actually know a lot about the South or about the West Coast or about you never know. So I always think start with your own network and think through who might, through word of mouth, have referrals. And then the other really big place that I always recommend newsrooms and editors go to is AILA. It's an acronym for the American Immigration Lawyers Association, and they have a tremendous database. Many of the folks that I have turned to personally for immigration counsel have been people who have served as past presidents, who are members themselves, who are just like really steeped in that community. The irony is that most of us here as experts are experts in First Amendment law or media. And so, Miriam, I just want to like bring you in as well, because I think that you know far more than any of us.
Definitely not, but I do think that everything that you've signaled is absolutely putting everybody on the right track. And Ayla is full of heroes, talk about, attorneys on the front line who are responding crisis after crisis with a tirelessness. And I think Scarlett is one of those heroes, but specific to Ayla, what you said, Nora, is so important about relationships. When you go into immigration court, the judge is used to having certain trial attorneys from DHS appear before him or her. The judges all know each other, right? They hear cases, and right before the lunch hour, they might have some banter around the water cooler. The respondents' attorneys are familiar to them. They have a certain reputation. So it's really important to tap into that. Relationships cannot be underscored. It cannot be underscored enough in an industry that, at the end of the day, as many, is personality driven or agenda driven. So find out who in the area of the immigration court proceedings has a good relationship with the judge, or who the judge has happened to maybe grant a few asylum cases with. That's just tactics. That's just being smart, right? You've got to know who opposing counsel is. You've got to know the personality of your judge, and you've got to know whether or not that judge has strong alliances with people on the defense bar. So Ayla is a great place to start, as well as you mentioned, just a personal network that is local to where the case is being heard. In addition, because immigration cases can be very, very expensive, most private practitioners that I know on an asylum case, for example, in Texas might charge anywhere in the range of between $10,000 to $20,000. That's a lot for someone who is undocumented or who maybe is documented but is a student or is just getting started. So it's prohibitively expensive for some. And unfortunately, like that's exactly where we are, right? This repression is targeting not only our most vulnerable, but our most outspoken. And so it's just the perfect storm for us to find, all these bodies, all these casualties. So to help people who might be low on funds, I think it would be important to also check out Immigration Advocates Network. I think they have a legal services directory, and Justia Legal Aid is here in Texas. They offer some pro bono services. My organization does also, but we have a very narrow scope of what type of cases we accept. In any case, I would certainly recommend that if someone is just has their back jammed up against a wall, to reach out to all of these. So AILA, Immigration Advocates Network Legal Services, and Justia Legal Aid. I also think that newsrooms should take it upon themselves to organize and figure out where these resources are, and how to get in touch with them. Which you also said about First Amendment issues not necessarily being central to the case is really important for immigration purposes, for court proceedings specifically, because although those issues are often incorporated into a broader removal defense, or as Scarlett will tell us, I believe in federal habeas litigation, actually in immigration court, the core expertise that is needed is immigration law specific, because removal defense is heavily dependent, its wins or losses, on a number of factors to include law, immigration law, current policy, and of course, as I mentioned, as in any other industry, relationships. So I think I should probably stop there, but those are kind of my broad brush strokes.
That's great. And I do want to get to Scarlett to talk about the habeas stuff, but just really quickly before I do, Miriam, because you mentioned the cost, which is a real concern for newsrooms, but also just I have a question about retaining the lawyer in the first place, because my understanding is that the person agreeing to the retention would have to be either the journalist themselves who's been detained or a close family member. Can that be done in advance? Can someone sign a retainer agreement in advance? It says, if I'm picked up, I want you to represent me. Could a newsroom have someone on retainer in advance to help with that?
Absolutely, 100%. And I think all of us on this panel would recommend that. I think getting a roster of vetted attorneys together is a first important step. And then an optional individual retainer for the journalist that can be paid for maybe by the newsroom, so that representation could be immediate. So I would think that since the detainee is the client and he or she has the ultimate and absolute control over who his or her choice for representation should be, that in and of itself doesn't preclude him or her from signing on ahead of time to have all of his or her ducks in a row. We just want to ensure that it is, at the end of the day, his or her choice. But for newsrooms to rally around that, and also I think maybe later in some discussion, if we have time, to figure out about maybe like what bail funds or bond funds options there might be that newsrooms can get behind. But I don't want to speak out of turn or tangentially. So yes, we should have that in advance. Just bearing in mind, most importantly, that it is the detainee who is the client and has the ultimate say on his or her defense.
Right. Okay, Scarlett, we've mentioned habeas several times now, and I think we probably have a lot of people in the audience who are not lawyers and don't know what this Latin term means. So, you are representing Mr. Guevara in his habeas petition. Maybe you could talk just a little bit about what habeas corpus is, how the process works, what it can accomplish for a non-citizen journalist.
Sure. So I'll start with a very basic primer, which will take about a minute, and then I'll talk a little bit about habeas in the immigration context and some of the habeas cases that we've been working on at the ACLU. Habeas corpus literally means in Latin, you have the body. It's a long-standing, centuries-old legal process that allows people who've been detained by the government to challenge their detention in court. The idea is that the detainee has to be presented before the court so that the court can weigh the legality of their confinement And their framers believed that habeas was so vital that they enshrined it in the US Constitution, which states in Article 1, Section 9, that the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless when in cases of rebellion or invasion, the public safety may require it. So that's an extraordinarily high bar. Folks are often most familiar with habeas in the criminal justice context. For example, it's invoked when someone's in prison for a state crime, but they believe that their detention violates federal law. It's become a really colloquial way to refer to almost any challenge to the legality of a conviction or sentence that's not a direct appeal to a higher court, but to a trial court, what's sometimes called a collateral challenge. But habeas also arises in the immigration context. It's been used, for example, to challenge the lack of a legal basis for immigration detention, prolonged immigration detention, or to require the government to hold a bond hearing for someone who's been in immigration detention for a certain period of time or prolonged period of time. In our student deportation cases, we're representing a number of students who've been targeted for deportation based on their speech. We've argued repeatedly that the government has placed students in immigration detention as unconstitutional retaliation for their political speech and that there was therefore no basis for their detention. And in Mario Guevara's case, we've argued that the government's refusal to release him, even after an immigration judge ordered him released on bond, similarly has no legal basis because it's for the impermissible purpose of restraining his reporting and punishing him for his past reporting. Habeas is not an unlimited remedy, and it may not always be a viable option, including for non-citizen journalists. For non-citizen journalists, and in fact for any immigrant detainee, the first question when considering habeas as an option is what justification the government is bringing to bear. Is that justification pretextual or not? If the justification is grounded in the journalist's speech or reporting, then it does implicate the First Amendment, and bringing a habeas petition may very well be appropriate. In the student deportation cases, for example, the government has made it very clear that it's relying on the student's speech to invoke a rarely used foreign policy ground to detain and attempt to deport them. And in Mario Guevara's case, the government has made numerous filings explicitly opposing the bond order, stating that his reporting is a danger to the community and that's the reason he must not be released. So I, just want to flag that whether or not to bring a habeas petition will really rely heavily on the facts. But just going back to the very beginning and to kind of tie what I'm talking about with some of the other strands of conversation that have emerged, I want to note that when considering bringing a habeas petition, it can be really critical to know when and where a journalist is detained as soon as possible. Going back to really like the first bullet point, particularly if the newsroom suspects they've been targeted for their reporting. Because if they have a viable basis for a habeas petition, the general rule is that the petition must be filed in the jurisdiction where the person is held. And if the government plans to transfer strategically or for logistical reasons, that person, especially to a southern facility or very far from where they are based, counsel will ideally want to file the petition before the transfer occurs. There's an exception to that rule where the custodian, so the facility that's holding the person or the location is unknown. And we've raised that exception in our student deportation cases where the students were spirited away in secret. And so the petitions had to be filed post-transfer, but the government has fought vociferously every step of the way regarding appropriate venue for the petition. So it's really optimal that if a petition is going to be filed, to do so before the transfer occurs or as quickly thereafter as possible. And I also want to note that, not to be alarmist, but in those cases, students couldn't always be located in the typical way. So in Badr Khansuri's case, who we represent, he was moved to 3 different locations in Virginia in the first 11 hours of his arrest. He was able to communicate with his wife at the second location, but his wife then informed his immigration counsel. And by the time that happened, he had already been moved to a 3rd location in Virginia and then placed on a plane en route to Louisiana. I'm not saying that this is to be expected. This is a pattern that's been most typical in our student deportation cases, but I think it ties into the repeated counsel that folks potentially think about having immigration counsel lined up ahead of time, just as the best preparation case this type of movement pattern occurs and it makes sense to file a habeas very quickly. And I should also note that when thinking about a habeas petition, and I'm almost done here, having experienced and local immigration counsel is the #1 priority. Basically, in all of our First Amendment habeas cases, including in the student deportation cases, Mario Guevara's case, we have a team comprising local immigration counsel and then lawyers from our immigrants' rights and free speech teams. I think on the First Amendment side with immigration counsel, the critical thing is really for them to know what to look for as the immigration case proceeds, at least at the outset. So is the government relying on speech or reporting as the basis for detention and or removal? Where is that documented? Having immigration counsel really look for that angle because they're going to be most familiar with the proceedings and the underlying documents is really critical. The last thing I want to just emphasize is what habeas can and can't accomplish. If successful, a habeas petition can release a person from immigration detention. It cannot resolve a person's immigration case, which generally has to proceed through the immigration courts.
Thanks, Scarlett. That's really helpful. I wanted to pick up on something you mentioned for Mr. Guevara's case. You mentioned that he was granted bond in the immigration court, but he was not actually released. And I was hoping you or Nora, who I know has also been active on that case, could unpack that aspect of it a little bit more, and talk generally about bond for immigration in the immigration system. Is that something that's usual? Are people released on bond? Is it unusual in Mr. Guevara's case that he got it and wasn't released? So tell us more about that.
So I think I'll just say a couple of things, but I actually defer, I think, really to Mariam about bond and how it works in the immigration setting because it's not an area that I have any expertise in. So bond is not always available, and we actually have litigation challenging this at the ACLU. So for example, we recently filed a class action lawsuit challenging a new ICE policy denying bond hearings and requiring mandatory detention for any person who entered the US without inspection. So folks who entered according to the government unlawfully. But as discussed, habeas may still be an option for those folks, even if they're not permitted, like the government is denying them essentially a bond hearing. Although our position is that everyone should be permitted to have a bond hearing. Mario's case is a little bit interesting. Again, the underlying facts can really be particular to each individual. He was granted bond because the IJ evaluated the two factors that are critical to making a bond determination. Is he a danger to the community or is he a flight risk? And found that he was neither. But I should note that I think we're seeing that it's a lot more typical for the government to appeal those types of decisions or even to file an emergency motion for a stay. I think Mario's case really did, stand out because in his type of situation where he has been in the country, entered lawfully, has legal authorization to work and live here, his situation is a very unique one in that it's not typical for the government to file an emergency motion for a stay and an appeal. But the other thing I should note is that the government explicitly relied on his reporting as the basis for refusing to release him and to basically fight through a stay petition and an appeal to argue against his release. And even though those facts seem unusual, it's also very possible that it's an emerging pattern where the government is going to be making those arguments more explicitly and more frequently, especially where they have folks who are either members of the press documenting ICE activity, or even members of the public who have been documenting ICE activity, arguing that they shouldn't be released basically on the basis of their documentation of that public activity, which is obviously very concerning.
Yeah, extremely worrying. Nora, did you want to add anything?
Well, I mean, we dove in, and first of all, like Scarlett's just so lovely. So it's wonderful to hear her primer on habeas. I feel like I'm back in law school and I'm like ready to litigate. So I love it. I guess I think just sort of, taking one step back existentially, if you will, I think a little bit in hearing all of these experts, about why we're here talking about the threat for immigrant reporters in particular. And I do think it's important to name. On the one hand, we have, I think, really these twin threats that Trump himself has promised. One is to subvert reality and create one single approved narrative. We have seen for many years, he and the agencies and the leaders that he has appointed to work under him have created a single narrative. And when he has disliked that story or the coverage therein, he has removed journalists from press briefings. He has threatened litigation. He has used agencies like the FCC to go after newsrooms themselves and their editorial decisions. That's sort of one threat, I think, posed over here, which is how reality and truth are being subverted. The number one sector that should be responsible for truth, for facts, for giving people information is the press. I think next to that then is the other promise that Trump himself has made, which is that he will be deporting larger numbers than ever before in the United States and getting rid of the quote unquote illegal immigration problem. And so those twin promises together of creating one narrative and doing away with censorship, a kind of warped promise, and the promise then of limiting people who come into this country, together create a perfect storm for those like immigrant reporters who are on the front lines trying to cover issues for immigrant communities, for non-English communities, and are then in the most immediate risky crosshairs. In Mario's case, I've known Mario for many, many years because I've worked and lived in Georgia. And I remember when another reporter contacted me, it was the day that he was arrested. It was within maybe 10 minutes. And I think it kind of helps to just name some of the particulars here, very briefly, because Scarlett's laying out what is available to us when we consider our legal options those themselves can sound overwhelming. Where do you start? And in Mario's case, at first he was picked up by local officials, not ICE. And so initially there was this thought that he was just going to be held by local officials in what is called DeKalb County. And so the first thing was to consider all of the various constitutional issues that would flow from that. But it was also incumbent upon everyone involved in that case very, very early on to anticipate that he might also be picked up by ICE and transferred from local custody to ICE custody. And so a number of things happened in the very early hours following his arrest. There were efforts to preserve documents. Sometimes the government has a convenient way of losing documents about very high profile cases. It's essential to get types of open records requests on file ASAP. And I see Sam, my fellow 1A in Georgia friend, nodding. That is essential. It's also essential then to make sure, as Scarlett sort of flagged, that credible, qualified local immigration counsel is ready, because you sometimes just do not know where the case may go. And the way that a case like Mahmoud Khalil's played out versus one of the other cases that Scarlett mentioned, Badr Sur Khan, those all have played out differently depending on a number of extremely immediate facts and circumstances that you cannot predict. Mario Guevara's case then really unfolded in an excruciating way. He was not found at various times throughout July, a month into his being detained. He was shuttled between upwards, I think, of 7 facilities. The Committee to Protect Journalists has a tremendous timeline that outlines what has happened in the Guevara case. We've been working to sort of create the force field around everything that Scarlett has been doing to release and get him out on bond. But I see this conversation as one little blip of the much broader question of how are we as a field and as civil society folks worried about basic rights, readying ourselves for a deluge of civil rights attacks and the erosion of constitutional freedoms. And that's the question that we will have to deal with more and more and more. And so every time we're confronted with a question here, like someone might be a danger to society, are they a danger to society? We have to think about why that narrative has been crafted and to completely reject that and remind folks, everyday people, what's really at stake. And so with the Mario case, he's been a reporter for 20 years in Atlanta, covering things for a community that really only has a small set of journalists helping them. He's a Spanish speaker. He's from a Central American country, covering issues for people throughout Central America who have moved to the United States. And he is currently the only journalist working on issues related to press and local issues in Georgia that is being held by the US government for his work. So that will probably become, will no longer be an exception, but I think that it's one we have to very, very much look at with clear eyes and in coordination, because these threats, these risks, and these detentions will likely rise.
Thanks, Nora. Yeah, the stakes are so important here and they're so high. And I don't think it's controversial to say that this is a campaign against speech. It's a campaign to try to silence people, to try to silence journalists, to try to prevent the public from knowing what the government is up to. And Alejandra, I wanted to ask, since you are in this community of journalists as part of your work coordinating, what is the sentiment among journalists that you're talking to? How are people feeling chilled? Are people determined to go on with their work? I'm sure there are a range of responses, but what are you hearing from the journalists that you're in touch with?
And it is a range of responses, right? On the one hand, we have journalists who were stringers for big news organizations in other parts of the world and then came to the US on some sort of asylum and now are worried about what their asylum cases, what might happen to their asylum cases. We also have locally obviously a number of reporters, right? We have independent reporters, we have reporters who work for nonprofit news organizations that are tiny, we have reporters who work for nonprofit news organizations that are way bigger, and then we also have reporters who work for legacy news organizations, right? Like the bigger ones, and those bigger news organizations a lot of the times use stringers, freelancers who cover immigration stories. And I think what we're hearing a lot is it's about all of these different layers of journalists who are not considered collectively or not, perhaps are not collectively thought as journalists, but all of them are journalists and all of them are feeling this pressure and this increased anxiety about what's going to happen to them, what's going to happen to their families. Could they be potentially be deported to a country that maybe they don't really know because they came to this country when they were really little, or countries in where there actually will be very dangerous for them to return to. And so what we really believe is that newsrooms have a responsibility really to step up at this time and to think about how they want to protect the journalists that they hire to report the news. This is a First Amendment issue, first and foremost, right? When you silence a reporter, you're really silencing the ability to provide information to our country, and that is at the basis of our democracy. But I also want to point out that newsrooms have done a really good job in the past in protecting the journalists, right? The Wall Street Journal's Evan campaign to free Evan is one that comes to mind and is often cited as something that we want to make sure that newsrooms are thinking about. How the journal structure its campaign to free Evans is how we're thinking newsrooms should be structuring themselves to become in the defense of reporters who are here in the United States as well.
Thanks, Alejandro. We are unfortunately almost out of time. And so we've covered a lot of ground. And so I want to give each of our panelists a chance to maybe sum up just a little bit. So we could maybe do just a little round robin before we end to say, if there's one takeaway that you would want newsrooms, journalists, or the public to take away from this topic of very first steps, what should be done when a journalist is detained by ICE or even thinking beforehand. What would that takeaway be? So Sam, maybe we can start with you.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, my the areas that I'm in right now are both, media law through being, in-house counsel for the Atlanta Community Press Collective, but have also been filing several habeas petitions challenging the prolonged detention of people in Georgia's ICE detention centers in Stewart and in Folkestone. And most of my career I've worked with journalists, and I really believe in, the importance of the First Amendment and public access. And, in the same way that it's constitutionally suspect for journalists, for people to be detained and denied bond because of their First Amendment expression, I also want to highlight that there are thousands of people detained in ICE detention centers across the US today who are also detained for for reasons that are also very constitutionally suspect, but might not necessarily be in retaliation for their First Amendment rights. And I think it's great when, journalists and their newsrooms can sort of leverage the resources that they have available to them to assert the constitutional rights of their non-citizen journalists who are unlawfully detained. And I hope that, as active members in civil society and, fans of democracy, I would just encourage people to extend that same level of concern for people who may or may not, be necessarily engaged in core First Amendment activity, but are just living their lives, which, necessarily involves free expression.
Thanks, Sam. Great point, and thank you for all the work you're doing on behalf of so many different people affected. Scarlett, your closing thoughts?
Um, I think I'll just end with a big picture point, which is that this administration has made it very clear that it considers the public and press documenting immigration enforcement to be a threat. It's described it as doxing and even violence. Those are the arguments that have essentially been raised regarding Mario's case. And I think it really ties into the broader trend of ICE agents acting like secret police, wearing masks, refusing to wear visible ID, driving around in unmarked vehicles. I think it's really of a piece with that truly terrifying trend. I think, therefore, journalists and newsrooms should be prepared for extremely hostile responses from the administration for covering immigration enforcement. And of course, this renders non-citizen journalists covering the issue extremely vulnerable. And I'll just mention that again, having local immigration counsel is the number one priority where a journalist has been arrested. If there is an instance where you think a journalist has been targeted, detained, arrested, based on their reporting, you can also reach out to an ACLU affiliate, or ACLU National as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Scarlett. Thank goodness for the ACLU. Miriam, your final takeaways.
I wish I had gone first because it's hard to top everybody else as we go. So good luck to Nora and Alejandro, right? But I think, I kept using the word chaos. So it's been really chaotic, right? We had the ICE director, acting director Leon's put out a memo in July saying to ICE and ERO agents, like, mandatory detention is the way to go. Then we had that really enforced by a Board of Immigration Appeals decision that stripped immigration judges of being able to have hold bond hearings in cases where, people are going to be detained, and it's going to be considered mandatory detention. And then we had the crazy, SCOTUS decision on Monday. But then we had, this wonderful opinion by Judge, I can't remember, I think maybe Judge Vera from SoCal saying, like, to hell with this, putting the shackles back on law enforcement to say, don't target our journalists. And here are the parameters that you've got to work inside of. I thought that was really beautiful, kind of Judge Vera reminding ICE, that a camera and a notepad are not threats to the public. And it was an example of a federal court stepping in explicitly to protect press in real time. So I was very appreciative of that. And I think my closing thoughts are not in my lane, but that the court of public opinion matters. We're seeing that on these immigration cases, where what the media does put out as narratives supporting our detained folks matters intensely. So I think a newsroom's rapid public response and strategic advocacy can produce the political will that speeds legal remedies and protects detained journalists.
That's a great point, Miriam. Yeah, the power of journalism. Alejandra, as a journalist, what are your takeaways from today?
I'm just feeling extremely thankful for all of you for having this panel and answering all of these very important questions that a lot of us are grappling with. I will say that one of the things that we heard today is that it is expensive, right? A bond could be up to $20,000. I think that's what I heard. And I would just say that it is the cost of doing business is also protecting ourselves. So it's money well spent. And if newsrooms don't have that budget right now, they should be thinking about having that budget in the next few months in the upcoming year, making sure that everyone is protecting the newsroom. The same reason that we have, employment insurance, we have insurance for an array of things in the workplace. And so it's not outside of the lines here. And again, thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Alejandra. Nora, I saved you for last. I'm
I
sorry.
can't believe it. I know. I'm like watching all of these amazing comments. I think newsrooms are often, and the media writ large is generally relatively allergic to discussing its own work, discussing how it gets done, and its own vulnerabilities. I also think that right now our society is risk averse and trending towards more risk aversion. The notion is, well, if I just sort of, hide away and don't catch anyone's eye, freedom may be something I can still grasp. But that really means that freedom has become a privilege. And we have to take up these various fights. I'm glad that Miriam mentioned the Los Angeles case. I'm from Los Angeles. I have been so proud of the work that's been done here on some of these issues regarding protests and press. And while every case must be brought with care, with thoughtfulness, with a kind of legal excellence, we also need the ethos across all of the work we're doing and the encouragement to take on big fights. We need that ethos throughout everything we are doing. We need it in newsrooms. We need newsrooms to take up the task of feeling like it's their job to protect their reporters. We need people who are in no way touching the media ecosystem to see how this might touch each of us, not just an immigrant reporter they know of who they write about somewhere. Because if it is one of those other people today, it could be one of us tomorrow. So we have to really look clearly at those risks and how they may be personal for each of us. So thank you so much. It was wonderful to be part of this discussion.
Thank you, Nora, and thanks to all our panelists for being here, for taking up this fight for journalism and free speech in our democracy. We truly appreciate all the work that you do and sharing your insights with us today. Thank you so much. And thanks to our audience for joining us. I'm sorry we're out of time. I think we could talk for another hour about this probably. But if you would like to learn more about our panelists, you can find out more about the Atlanta Community Press Collective that Sam is a part of by visiting tlpresscollective.com, and also Asian Americans Advancing Justice Atlanta is at www.advancingjustice-atlanta.org. You can find Nora's work for Free Press at freepress.net. For more on the ACLU, you can visit aclu.org. If you want to learn more about Mario Guevara's case, you can visit aclu.org/cases/Guevara v. Francis. To learn more about the Muslim Legal Fund of America, where Miriam works, you can visit mlfa.org. And last but not least, you can read Alejandra's work at injusticewatch.org or find out more about investigative reporters and editors at www.ire.org. And finally, you can read more about freedom of the press and our work by visiting our website, freedom.press. And to help us continue advocating for journalists across the country, we need your help. And so I would just ask that you consider donating to us if you're able at freedom.press/donate. Thank you again so much to our panelists and our audience for this wonderful, important conversation.